September the 17th, 2025, a date that will not fade quietly into history. On that morning in New York City, inside the Great Hall of the United Nations, a young soldier from a landlocked nation stood before the world and demanded something no African leader had dared to speak so openly. $847 billion in reparations, not aid, not charity, reparations. For more than 60 years, rivers of gold, streams of uranium, and harvests of cotton had flowed from Burkina Faso into the coffers of Paris. Yet the people who tilled the soil remained poor, their children left to walk dusty roads with empty stomachs. And now, one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, declared that the bill was due. He was not begging. He was not bowing. He was calling out centuries of theft with a voice that carried the weight of an entire continent. And the question rose like thunder in the chamber. Would Africa finally refuse to be silent? Stay with us, for this is not just another headline. It is the living echo of a dream carried by our ancestors, the dream of an Africa that shall never bow again. Subscribe, and walk with us into that future. September the 17th, 2025. The United Nations General Assembly was already heavy with ceremony when the doors opened, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked to the podium. He wore the uniform of a soldier, not the tailored suit of a diplomat. His step was firm, his eyes unwavering. Behind him were not just the 28 million citizens of his homeland, but the spirit of 1.4 billion Africans whose voices had too long been drowned by the echo of empire. The chamber had seen fiery words before. It had heard denunciations, protests, even threats. But this moment was different. Traoré's very presence carried a defiance that could not be dismissed as rhetoric. He stood there as though the soil of Burkina Faso itself had risen to demand justice. When he began to speak, his words fell like a hammer upon the polished desks of world power. "Distinguished delegates," he said, his voice steady, "I stand before you not as a beggar seeking favor, but as the voice of a continent betrayed." In that instant, the silence of the hall turned electric. Translators rushed to capture his cadence, but no translation could soften the weight of his words. He was not addressing the five powers who claimed the right of veto. He was speaking to the forgotten majority, the nations whose sweat and soil had been traded for coins that never returned home. He spoke of 65 years of theft, dressed as partnership. Of cotton harvested in the Sahel, woven in French mills, sold back at triple the price. Of uranium carved from African earth, fueling the lights of Paris while villages in Niger and Burkina Faso sat in darkness. Of gold extracted, billions upon billions, yet the miners' children carried buckets of muddy water instead of books. Then he raised the number that would burn itself into history. $847 billion. Not a symbol, not a metaphor. A ledger of loss, written in hard figures, presented before the world. He declared, "If this institution refuses to act, if justice is once again denied, Africa will walk out. We will not remain seated in chambers that legitimize our exploitation. We will not lend our presence to the theater of our own subjugation." The hall trembled with the weight of the ultimatum. And then, something extraordinary happened. One by one, delegations of African nations rose to their feet. 32 countries stood as if summoned by ancestral memory. Their applause grew into a thunder that rolled for 12 unbroken minutes. It was not polite clapping. It was not protocol. It was the sound of chains breaking. From the floor, the representatives of China, Russia, India, and Brazil joined in, their hands striking together in acknowledgement that the tide had shifted. Across the hall, the Western Bloc sat motionless, stunned, their silence louder than words. The Secretary-General shifted uneasily, caught between applause and paralysis. For 12 minutes the clapping did not cease. Cameras panned across faces wet with tears, fists raised in salute. To the elder delegates it recalled another moment, Bandung 1955, when nations of Asia and Africa declared they would no longer be pawns in Cold War games. But here, in New York, it was Africa that spoke with one voice, and it was the young captain who carried that voice. When the ovation finally ebbed, Traoré remained unmoved. He did not smile. He did not bask in the praise. He simply continued, as though he had only just begun, and in truth, he had. The flame was lit, and the hall knew it. Something had shifted forever. When Captain Traoré raised the figure $847 billion, the hall gasped, for it was not a number plucked from thin air. It was the arithmetic of history, calculated with the precision of economists, and the testimony of generations who had watched their land stripped bare. He began with the Communauté Financière Africaine franc system known simply as the CFA franc. Under its rules, Burkina Faso and 14 other African nations were forced to deposit half of their foreign reserves into the French treasury. For decades, Paris dictated their currency, their trade, their very breadth of economic life. From this mechanism alone, $312 billion had flowed north. Money earned in Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Bamako, but spent in Marseille and Lyon. Then came the tally of resources, the raw veins of Africa's body carved open for someone else's profit. From 1960 until the present year, French companies extracted $285 billion in gold from Burkina Faso. Of that immense wealth, barely $12 billion remained in the nation's coffers. Uranium worth $89 billion was mined, with only $4 billion paid to the government. Cotton, the very crop whose fibers once tore the backs of enslaved Africans in America, yielded $74 billion in exports, yet its true value was stitched into garments in Parisian factories. Manganese and other minerals added another $87 billion. The sum was staggering, $535 billion in resources. Added to the $312 billion drained by the CFA franc system, the total reached the historic debt, $847 billion. Traore did not present this as theory. He held documents prepared by African economists and international legal experts. He spoke of international law, citing the United Nations' own Resolution 1514, the Declaration on Decolonization. He reminded the Assembly of the International Court of Justice's rulings on state responsibility. He quoted the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. His case was not only moral, it was legal, binding, undeniable. Then he drove the knife deeper. France did not merely trade with us, it controlled our markets, fixed our prices, and stole our future. When we produced gold, we could not set its price. When we grew cotton, we could not choose our buyers. The very money in our pockets was chained to Paris. This is not partnership. This is systematic theft. For the African American elders watching from afar, these words struck a chord. The memories of fields in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, where black hands picked cotton that built fortunes for others, echoed in the tale of Burkina Faso's farmers. The injustice was familiar. The language of debt, servitude, and exploitation was one that their grandparents had lived, one that their ancestors had died under. And yet, here was an African leader naming it without apology, demanding that the bill be paid, not charity, not loans with conditions, payment for theft. The chamber murmured as Traore concluded the account. $847 billion, that is the value of our silence. And today, we refuse to be silent any longer. It was a moment that transformed numbers into symbols. Each dollar was not just currency but memory of children denied education, of mothers who died giving birth without hospitals, of villages left without clean water while Paris glowed with light. For too long the West had told Africa it was poor, dependent, incapable. But Traore's arithmetic flipped the script. Africa was not poor. It had been robbed. The applause returned, heavy, deliberate. Some Western delegates shifted uncomfortably, whispering into earpieces, their faces pale with the weight of undeniable mathematics. And to those who listened beyond the chamber in the diaspora, in the neighborhoods of Harlem and Chicago, in the towns of the Caribbean, in the streets of Accra and Lagos, the message was clear: Africa's bill had come due. The weight of the reparations demand might have been enough to shake the chamber, but Captain Traoré was not finished. He turned his eyes toward the very institution that hosted him, and with words sharp as iron, he dismantled its legitimacy before the world. For 78 years, the United Nations had presented itself as the temple of international cooperation. Yet, Traoré declared, it had been a mask concealing the same imbalance of power forged in 1945, when 5 nations claimed permanent seats on the Security Council, along with the power to veto the will of billions. 5 countries, he thundered, who won a war 80 years ago, now hold veto power over 8 billion souls. Africa, 54 nations, 1.4 billion people has no permanent seat, no veto, no voice. The indictment cut deep. Traoré pointed to France, a nation of 68 million, wielding the power to block resolutions affecting an entire continent. He reminded the world that the United States, which had invaded more countries than any other since World War II, still lectured Africa about the rule of law. He named the hypocrisy of powers that bombed Libya in the name of human rights, but vetoed resolutions condemning their own crimes. The chamber was restless. Delegates shifted in their chairs as he pressed on. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, he said, were no better. They call them development institutions, he declared. But they are weapons of debt. They deindustrialized our economies. They privatized our water, our schools, our health. They made us beggars in our own land. Images of the 1980s structural adjustment programs flashed in the memories of many. Nations forced to cut education, to sell off state industries, to watch their currencies collapse all under the weight of assistance. The audience knew these scars. And then came the example that silenced even the skeptics, Libya. Traore recalled that in 2011, Libya held the highest living standard in Africa. Yet under the doctrine of responsibility to protect, NATO bombed its cities, toppled its leader, and left chaos to spread across the Sahel. Where, he demanded, was the United Nations' responsibility to protect Libyans from Western bombs? His voice rang across the chamber, unanswerable. Western delegates looked down at their papers, their silence damning. But Traore did not only accuse, he exposed the structure itself. The Security Council, he said, was not governance. It was imperialism codified. The IMF and World Bank were not engines of development, they were chains, and the doctrine of humanitarian intervention was nothing more than a pretext for conquest. The climax came with a line that echoed beyond the walls. This is not international law. This is organized hypocrisy. For those listening in Harlem, in Montgomery, in Johannesburg, the words resonated deeply. They remembered promises of democracy, promises of equality, promises never kept. They knew the face of hypocrisy well. Then Traore turned from accusation to invitation. Africa will no longer wait for permission. We will build without it. We will speak without it. We will live without it. He paused, letting the silence carry his challenge. Then he spoke directly to the watching millions across the diaspora. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. The chamber, for a moment, was hushed. Western powers had no reply. But the nations of the global south, from Asia to Latin America, knew they had just heard something different. Not just a protest, but a declaration of independence. The confrontation was complete. The emperor had been named, and his clothes declared invisible. The question that remained was whether the world would follow Traore into the storm, or cling to the crumbling pillars of the old order. After the indictments, after the exposure of theft and hypocrisy, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did what few expected. He offered an alternative. Not vague rhetoric, not empty slogans, but a blueprint for a new world. He called it the Global South Assembly. He spoke not as a man pleading for reform within a broken structure, but as an architect sketching the foundation of a new house where billions might finally find shelter. We will not beg for a seat at the master's table, he declared. We will build our own. The design was bold and concrete. Every nation would have equal representation, regardless of its armies or its wealth. No veto power would exist to silence the majority. Decisions would be made by consensus or majority, not by the stroke of a single Western hand. Then came the institution's pillars to hold this new assembly upright. A reparations tribunal, with authority to calculate and enforce compensation for centuries of exploitation. A South-South development bank, a true alternative to the IMF and World Bank, offering loans without conditionalities, without the poison of privatization. A global South court, empowered to adjudicate disputes between nations of the South, free from the gavel of imperial judges. A decolonization commission, tasked with identifying and dismantling every mechanism of colonial control still lingering in the 21st century. A South-South Security Council, to resolve conflicts without Western intervention, without bases, without bombers. And then he announced the timeline. December 15, 2025. In the city of Ouagadougou, capital of Burkina Faso, the founding conference would be held. Nations ready to prioritize solidarity over Western approval were invited to attend. By November 1st, commitments were expected. If 100 countries joined, he declared, the assembly would represent more people than the entire Western Bloc combined. The symbolism was striking. Ouagadougou, the birthplace of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once told Africans to live with dignity, even if it means we must die with dignity. Now, His city was to host the birth of an institution that could finish the work he began. Traore's tone grew almost prophetic. When black soil meets black will, no empire can stand against it. His words echoed not just across Africa, but through the memory of every people who had tasted subjugation. For African Americans listening, the dream was familiar. It was the dream of owning the blueprint, not merely laying the bricks. It was the dream denied in Montgomery, in Harlem, in Detroit, a dream now spoken aloud by a young captain on the world stage. The Global South Assembly was more than diplomacy. It was a covenant. A promise that Africa would not remain an object in someone else's story, but a subject with pen in hand. In the chamber, reactions split like fault lines. 32 African delegations pledged immediate support. China, Russia, India, Brazil, the great powers of the South, signaled their alignment. Latin America nodded with solidarity, recalling centuries of their own exploitation. Meanwhile, the Western seats grew rigid with alarm. For them, this was no longer protest. This was rebellion dressed in legality, revolution wrapped in diplomacy. They understood what it meant. The monopoly was breaking. Traore closed this section not with threat, but with invitation. We do not seek war. We do not seek isolation. We seek dignity. If the old world cannot give it, then the new world will. It was a vision as daring as it was dangerous. And in that vision, Africa was not the beggar at the door, but the builder of a new house. The hall had heard the charges. It had listened to the figures. It had been confronted with an alternative. Now came the response, and it revealed, more clearly than any speech, the fault lines of a divided world. From the South, the endorsements came swiftly. 32 African nations pledged support for the reparations demand and the Global South Assembly. Their statements were brief but powerful. South Africa declared, Africa must unite behind the demand for historical justice. Nigeria added, Western extraction must be accounted for and compensated. Ghana affirmed, the time has come for Africa to speak with one voice. Kenya announced, the Global South Assembly offers hope for true democracy. Beyond Africa, the chorus grew louder. China's ambassador rose. Captain Ibrahim speaks truth about an international system that serves the few at the expense of the many. China supports more democratic governance. Russia's foreign minister echoed, the current United Nations system reflects 1945, not 2025. Reform is inevitable. India, Brazil, Venezuela, Iran, each aligned themselves with the call. It was a tidal wave of affirmation. For once, the Global South was not whispering its discontent. It was roaring. And yet, on the other side of the hall, the West sat pale and restless. The United States condemned the speech as divisive rhetoric that threatens cooperation. France called the accusations baseless and spoke of partnership. The United Kingdom dismissed reparations as historically inaccurate and economically impossible. Germany insisted that reform should happen within existing mechanisms. But their words rang hollow. None could refute the precise figures, the documented theft, the legal citations. Their denials sounded less like arguments and more like fear. Fear was justified. For if Burkina Faso's claim succeeded, the precedent would be unstoppable. 14 other CFA franc nations could file similar demands. Former British colonies might calculate centuries of extraction and seek compensation from London. Latin America could pursue Spain and Portugal. Even China, humiliated by unequal treaties in the 19th century, might demand reparations from Western powers. Trillions stood to change hands. The hall felt the tremor of possibility. What began as one nation's voice could become an avalanche. Western diplomats scrambled. Behind the scenes, meetings were called. Offers of aid and trade were quietly extended to nations considering Ouagadougou. Threats of sanctions and investment withdrawal were whispered. The IMF and World Bank hinted at loan suspensions. Western banks moved to restrict credit. Media outlets unleashed a campaign, branding the Global South Assembly as anti-Western and authoritarian. But the desperation betrayed the truth. The monopoly was cracking. To many, the scene recalled Bandung, 1955. Then, 29 nations had gathered to declare independence from Cold War alignment. Now, in 2025, in a hall where Western power had long gone unchallenged, an African leader had lit a fire that threatened to consume the old order. In Harlem and Chicago, in Lagos and Kingston, the diaspora watched with a mixture of pride and disbelief. A son of Africa had stood at the center of the world stage, and declared that the empire had no clothes. For the elders who remembered segregation, who had marched for civil rights, who had buried too many under the weight of injustice, it was more than a speech, it was vindication. The ovation of 12 minutes had not been mere applause. It had been a drumbeat, a summons, a declaration that Africa was no longer alone. And in that moment, whether they admitted it or not, the West knew, the ground beneath their institutions had shifted. The monopoly of power, once untouchable, now trembled under the feet of those it had tried to silence. History does not always announce itself with cannon fire. Sometimes it arrives in the steady voice of a young captain, speaking for the dead, the living, and the yet unborn. The shockwave had begun, and nothing would be the same again. As the echoes of that September day continue to reverberate, one truth stands clear. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not merely speak for Burkina Faso. He spoke for Africa, for the global South, and for every descendant of those whose labor-built empires they were never allowed to inherit. The demand for $847 billion was more than an accounting. It was a reckoning. It said that history cannot be buried beneath treaties or silenced by diplomacy. It insisted that justice is not charity but debt, and debt must be paid. The proposal for a global South Assembly was more than vision. It was structure. A world without vetoes. A world without double standards. A world where black, brown, and forgotten nations could sit as equals, not as spectators. December 15th in Ouagadougou was no longer just a date. It was a promise that the South would gather to shape its own future. And for those of us in the diaspora, in the streets of Harlem, in the churches of Atlanta, in the neighborhoods of Detroit, it was a reminder that the struggle of our ancestors was not in vain. The cotton fields of Alabama spoke to the cotton fields of Burkina Faso. The chains of one era resonated with the currencies and contracts of another. And in that connection, dignity found its voice again. The West may scramble, its newspapers may mock, its diplomats may panic, but the ovation of 12 minutes cannot be erased. The applause of 32 African nations cannot be silenced. The dream of Sankara, now carried by Traore, cannot be contained. So let us remember, history bends when ordinary people believe it can. It bends when nations refuse silence. It bends when Africa stands, not as a beggar, but as a builder. If this story moved something in your chest, do not scroll past. Like, share, speak. Subscribe because they hid our history long enough. Let us speak our future out loud. And as you leave this story, leave your mark. Write it in the comments. Write it in your spirit. Write it in the wind. Africa rise. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.